there. Welcome to ManchTalk. I'm Tammy Simmons. I'm your host, and I'm glad you're tuning in today. It is Tuesday, and it was supposed to be like 47 degrees and raining out today. Well, it is raining, but I don't think it's 47 because it is like a sheet of ice out there. It's really pretty on the trees, but it's a mess on the roadways. A lot of accidents last night. The sidewalks are definitely slick, so if you have to go out today on Tuesday, if you're watching this tonight, still be careful because I think overnight we'll probably have more freezing, and that probably won't be so good. This morning, I watched an interesting video on Facebook that was posted by Kentucky Congressman Thomas Massie. He's one of my favorite congressmen. The legislators in Kentucky actually are among my favorite overall. But he was doing, he made a reference to Schoolhouse Rock. So if you were a kid in the 60s or the 70s, you might remember the Schoolhouse Rock and how they taught us how a bill became a law and things like that. But he put together a video explaining how and why the federal government ends up in a shutdown situation, and how if they had actually followed the laws that they put in place by themselves, these shutdowns could be avoided. The video is a little long, so it's going to take up a portion of the show, but it is definitely worth a watch. Watch this.
Hi, this is Congressman Thomas Massie from Kentucky. We're going to try a little Schoolhouse Rock today. I'm in the middle of a government shutdown here, and I want to talk about why that happened, why it didn't used to happen, how we keep it from happening. Because I think this is legislative malpractice, what you're witnessing in the Senate and the House. And let me talk about that. In 1974, Congress passed something called the Congressional Budget Act. It says that we should pass 12 separate appropriations bills. That's important. And I'm going to talk about why it's important to do 12 separate bills instead of one giant bill. You've heard of these giant bills before. Sometimes they call it an omnibus, sometimes they call it continuing resolution, CR for short. Folks, that ain't normal. What we're supposed to do is pass 12 separate bills. When you put all of the government funding in one bill, when you put all your eggs in one basket, somebody can take that hostage, any faction of government. It could be the Freedom Caucus, for instance, who are good friends of mine. But today, what we're witnessing is that the Democrats in the Senate have taken government hostage. But we enabled them to do it by putting all the bills together. Senator Schumer has a demand, along with Senator Durbin. He says, I want DACA. And I'm keeping all of government hostage until I get DACA. Well, if we would have done our jobs back before September 30th, which was the actual deadline, and passed 12 separate appropriations bills and sent them to the Senate, we wouldn't be in this position. Let's talk about what those 12 separate bills are. Some of them are very non-controversial. They've passed in the House before, and I've voted for them. The first one, that's not very controversial, as you can imagine, is the legislative branch. This is the bill that funds Congress and the Library of Congress. And within that are all the senators and representatives' salaries and their staff's salaries. How many senators and representatives do you really think aren't going to vote to pay themselves? Not very many. So when this bill comes to the floor, and it has in the House, I don't know that it ever has in the Senate, it passes. And this hostage moves over here. Ledge branch. Let me talk quickly about some of the other hostages that are in the room today that don't need to be in the room. CJS, this is an appropriations bill. It stands for Commerce, Justice, and Science. So this funds the Department of Commerce, which is constitutional. It has the Patent Office in it, for instance. The Justice Department, look, we want to be holding court, right? And the judges don't collect their own taxes, so Congress has to fund that as well. And then science, that's got NASA in it. That's a fairly non-controversial bill. And when it comes up for a vote in the House, it passes too. So this is CJS. What are some of the other ones that can make it out of the room easily with a bipartisan majority? Well, there's a bill here that funds the Department of Energy and the Army Corps of Engineers. Now, most Republicans aren't big fans of the Department of Energy. That was started by Jimmy Carter in the late 70s. But everybody's a fan of infrastructure. For instance, the Army Corps of Engineers maintains the dams and the ports, and some of these dams keep the water that may be providing your municipal water supply to your city. So this is a bill that usually passes, or could pass easily, with a bipartisan majority. What I'm saying is, if they bring it up in the Senate, it would get 60 votes easily, because I've seen it get a majority here in the House, a large majority. So let's put this one over here. That's the DOE and the Army Corps. What are some other ones? We've got financial services, and D.C. That's right, there's an appropriations bill to fund Washington, D.C. because it's not a state, it's a federal city. Well, guess what? 90+% of Washington, D.C. is Democrat. So the Democrats are going to vote for the bill that funds Washington, D.C. And financial services has to do with banking. Republicans aren't going to go back to their banker friends and say, oh, I'm sorry I didn't get the financial services bill passed. So that one's going to make it out of the room too. See how easy this is? I'm telling you, the 60-vote rule is not a problem in the Senate with these bills. All right, who else do we have over here that can make it out? The VA. There is a bill dedicated to funding the VA. Which Republican or Democrat is going to go back home and say, you know what, I didn't think we should fund the VA, so I voted against the bill to fund the VA? The answer is none. I have seen this bill pass the House of Representatives on its own with every member. We're not talking about getting to 218. We get to 435. And this isn't a day that you don't want to be here, because you want to have your name on that VA bill. So the VA bill passes. And we've got the defense bill here. Now, Republicans and Democrats do argue, and independents, about how much we should be spending at the Department of Defense. But nobody is going to go to the floor and say we shouldn't pay our soldiers today. In fact, there have been proposals during the shutdown to pass this bill so that soldiers will get paid. I think we should pass this bill. I think we should bring it up on its own. And when we do, after all the wrangling is done about how much we're going to spend on bombers and how much on aircraft carriers and paying for the soldiers' salaries, the defense bill makes it over here, if it's voted on by itself. Okay, now we're getting to just a few bills in here that are harder to pass. One is called, I don't make these names, they were here before I got here, affectionately called THUD, one of the appropriations bills. It stands for Transportation and HUD. Now, again, this is like the bill that funds the Department of Energy and the Army Corps of Engineers. It's got some stuff that Democrats like, HUD, but it's also got transportation in it. And everybody likes transportation infrastructure. That's one of the legitimate roles of the government. So we can get THUD passed too. Transportation and HUD. By the way, folks, I've never voted for an omnibus, and I've never voted for a CR. But most of these bills that I put on this side of the fence, I have voted for, and they get bipartisan majorities very easily in the House. Who do we have left over here? We've got the Interior and Environment. Well, this bill, its primary function is to fund the EPA. Okay, you've got another bill over here that funds the Department of Labor, Education, I'm going to call that EDU, and HHS. That's the regulatory authority that tells you what health care you can and can't buy. A lot of Democrat priorities in here, in this bill, a lot of Democrat priorities in this bill. You've also got Homeland Security. I'm just going to put Homeland Security. That could pass, but there's a lot of discussion about immigration and funding our protection of our borders. If you're going to build a wall, it's going to be in this bill. So that is a contentious bill. I'm not going to say it makes it out of the room easily. You've also got USDA and the FDA over here. These are the folks who tell you how to farm, what you can eat, what medical devices you're allowed to use. This is regulatory authority here. There are also some farm subsidies in this bill as well. So these are the types of bills you got. You've also got a bill here that funds the State Department and foreign aid. I'm just going to call it foreign aid for now. Foreign aid. Okay, can you imagine if we had done at least part of our job, if we had done 7/12 of our job, if we had passed all the bills that Republicans and Democrats agree to, passed all the bills that can get 60 votes in the Senate. Today, Chuck Schumer and Dick Durbin and the other folks over there in the Senate would be demanding that we pass DACA, or else they're going to shut down the EPA, or shut down the FDA, or shut down foreign aid, or shut down the Department of Education. How ridiculous is that? They couldn't get away with it. So by reducing the number of hostages in the room, you reduce the leverage of any faction of government here, whether, as in the case today, is Chuck Schumer, or whether that would be the Freedom Caucus at some point. And if the government did shut down, as it has today, what would, these things, soldiers would be getting paid, claims would be getting processed at the VA, transportation would keep going on, HUD applications would be processed, NASA would still be funded, the rocket scientists could still go to work, DC would be funded, the Army Corps projects wouldn't slow down. All that stuff would be funded, even if somebody's having a little temper tantrum over here, like it's been going on for 3 days. So, just to close this out, what do we need to do to keep this from happening again? Because, folks, the answer today, the big, brilliant solution they came up with, was to fund the government with an all-inclusive bill for 3 more weeks. We're going to be in the same position 3 weeks from now. So the answer is to pass these bills separately. The law tells us to, the 1974 law. Let me talk a little bit about the why. Why don't they do it this way? Because it makes so much sense. They don't like to do it this way because when you debate all of these bills, it gives the membership a lot more power and the leadership has less power. When you put everything in one giant bill called an omnibus bill, that gives the leadership, and let's say that's 4 people in the Senate and 4 people in the House, the power to do what they want behind closed doors. Then they come out from behind the closed doors and tell the membership, that would include me, you've got to vote for this bill today. We're not going to give you time to read it. Yeah, we know it's 2,000 pages long, and we know you're tired, and but we want to pass this tomorrow. And if you don't vote for it, you're going to have to go home and explain to your constituents, many of whom like these things over here, why you shut down the government. That's a very powerful message that the leadership gives to rank and file members here. And most rank and file members end up voting for the all-inclusive bill. By the way, sometimes they throw extra hostages in the room like they did today. The child health care program, CHIP, was in the room today, and so was the medical device tax, something that Republicans want to get rid of. But there's another reason why this happens up here, and this has been disappointing to me. Some of my colleagues would rather just take one vote because it's pretty messy when they go on the record and start voting for all of these bills and all of the amendments that have to do with crafting these bills. Now they could be held accountable for being for something or against something. Whereas if they're presented with a choice at the end of the year, or as in this case 3 or 4 times in the year as the crises come up, if they're presented with a choice that says vote for this and the government stays open, or vote against it and the government will shut down, they can go back home and say, you know what, I felt like even though I don't want to fund foreign aid, and I don't want to fund the war on drugs, and I don't want to fund another war in the Middle East, and I don't want to fund this welfare program or X, Y, and Z, you name it. They say, you know what, but I didn't have a choice. It was all in that one bill, so I had to vote for it. That absolves them of accountability, and it makes it easier for them to get reelected. What we need to do is we need to get back to 12 appropriations bills, because we're going to be in the same situation, if not in 3 weeks, then in 3 months, or at the end of this fiscal year. So tell your congressman, tell anybody you know that works in Washington, D.C., get back to doing your job. Do 12 separate appropriations bills so we can see what you're doing, and so you don't hold government hostage ever again. Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it. So this is what I hear when I'm talking to people. People are mostly outraged about the federal government shutdown when it pertains, because we're delaying pay for active duty men and women serving in the military. And, nobody, I don't think even people who oppose war and all this stuff, nobody wants to, withhold our military's paychecks. And people do get outraged when the most vulnerable people in our society are withheld benefits, and I can just say, for instance, those seeking medical care at our VA hospital here in Manchester. Nobody wants to have bad things happen to those people for the short term. But you know what? If we didn't constantly come to a stalemate over whether it's funding a wall on the border of Mexico or DACA or whatever the pet story of the day is, and if instead we just followed the law and followed the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 and did the budget appropriations the way the law says we're supposed to do them, and not in these big omnibus bills, we'd actually be far better off. And I don't usually use President Trump's words to express myself, or whether I think some of the things he says is what I would say, but I will say this. Maybe it really, really, really is time to start draining that swamp, because so many of our congressmen and senators just don't seem to be doing the job that they're sent there to do, or follow the laws that are put in place to keep them in control. So anyways, enough about the DC swamp. I'd rather get back to Manchester. Apparently this week at the school committee meeting last night on Monday, the school committee spent, again, a lengthy amount of time debating whether or not they should send yet another letter to the state legislature to tell them that they oppose SB 193, which is the bill that would allow the existence of education savings accounts. That would be where the parents of a child currently in the public school building could take their child and put them in a private school or homeschool or whatever they feel is best for their child and their specific needs. And the adequacy money that the state of New Hampshire pays to the school district would follow them. So we're talking about $3,600, somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000, depending on which number and who's doing the math. It doesn't really matter. Let's say it's $4,000, which, just for the sake of argument. But the school committee keeps having these votes on whether or not to send this letter. And they've already authorized the superintendent to send a letter to the legislature, which they did. And our new mayor, Joyce Craig, took it upon herself to personally go up and testify at a House committee hearing on this bill, and say that the school committee in Manchester opposes this legislation. But yet we're going to vote again and again on sending another letter or a third letter or an 18th letter, I don't know, whatever. I guess each letter that we send just says they really meant it. Last letter we meant it. Now we really, really, really mean it. We really, really don't want you to pass this bill. Keep in mind that this has never been a unanimous vote on the Manchester School Committee. It's split about 50-50, usually one vote in in the direction of sending the letter. So it hardly represents all of the people representing us on the school committee. And on the subject of education savings accounts, I read earlier this week where my school committee member, John Avard, he was saying he didn't think SB 193 went far enough, which intrigued me. But what he was saying is, well, if the kid's allowed to take this funding, we're going to say $4,000, which I don't think it's that much, but let's just say $4,000. then that student shouldn't be also allowed to participate in the extracurricular activities at the school building, such as sports or drama club or any kind of anything outside of the education. Right now, if you are homeschooled, you can go, or if you go to a charter school, you can still play football on the football team. John Avard was saying he thinks that if the parents are allowed to take this $4,000 and put it in an education savings account and move their child out of the school building, that they should now have to pay to play sports. And that got me thinking. He's saying it should be an all or nothing thing. Well, how about this? I'd like an all or nothing policy too. Dan and I spend probably $4,000 a year in money that goes into the public school buildings in Manchester. Now, after the Claremont cases, the Supreme Court in the state of New Hampshire decided that I, as a taxpayer, was obligated to fund public education, an adequate public education for the kids in the state of New Hampshire. So that's where that $3,600 or $4,000, I think it's like $3,900, whatever, that number comes from. That is the money that is raised by the statewide property tax. It goes to the state of New Hampshire, and then it gets divvied back out to the districts depending on how many students are enrolled in their schools. Now, in Manchester, we spend probably like $11,000 per student. That means that even if you took $4,000 away if that one child left the school building, there'd still be $7,000 on the table to use towards the other kids in the school building. I don't see how this is so detrimental to the public school buildings unless, of course, nobody wants to make the hard choices that they're going to have. Now, John DePietro, who's ran for school board over in Ward 6, he does a lot of number crunching and everything. I'm going to put up a graph on the screen just to show you. This is how the student population in Manchester has declined from 2007 to 2017. That's the green numbers. Now the yellow numbers, that's the school budget, which has increased every year since 2017. The school budget has gone up $19.7 million since 2007, yet we have more than 3,200 fewer students. Doesn't that seem a bit crazy to you? Now, think of it this way. Try to put it in real life terms. Imagine you're a family of 6 and you go out and you spend, $200 a week on groceries to feed your family. But as your kids grow up and leave the household and it's just you and your husband, you continue to keep spending the same $200. You keep buying many gallons of milk and dozens of eggs and all this stuff. And every week you're just throwing this food away because you don't have the mouths to feed anymore. Now, if the price of eggs jumps up 30 cents, is the real problem that the price of eggs jumped up 30 cents, or is the problem that you're still buying groceries to feed a family of 6 when there's only 2 of you left? It's the same kind of thing that's happening in our school system. In the 20 years that I've been a homeowner, I have never seen us drop the school budget when our student population dropped. And we're not talking small numbers. We have increased in 10 years the school budget by almost 14%, yet we've almost declined our student population by almost 19%. The problem isn't whether or not we're going to pull out $3,600 or $4,000 and leave $7,000 on the table for every child that decides they want to leave the public school building here in Manchester. The problem is that the school committee, the school administration, they just simply do not want to accept that we are spending money as if we had thousands and thousands more students still in our school. The Bedford kids left over a decade ago, more than a decade ago. Yet we continue to spend money as if we still were educating all those kids that are going to school in Bedford. How this can be acceptable and how the school committee can try to turn things to make it sound like we won't give them enough. And if we let this small number of children leave our school, it's going to decimate our school budget. The estimates of kids that would leave with education savings accounts is probably between 1% and 3%. John DePietro's done numbers, and he said even if 10% of Manchester students left and took their money with them, that we would still have more money left on the table, and per student spending in Manchester would be higher than it is now. How can that be a terrible thing, and why all the need to constantly oppose the concept of allowing parents to make the best choices for their children? And for all kids, that doesn't mean in the school building that is built in their neighborhood. Kids should be able to choose from private schools, home schools, charter schools, you name it. I'd like to see more of my tax dollars go to benefit more kids in the state of New Hampshire. And if that means that they're not in a public school building, I'm perfectly okay with that. So that's really all I had. It's funny how no matter what subject matter I come up with, I keep coming back to education savings accounts. Eventually the bill will actually pass, and then we'll just have to hear about the sky is falling and all that from those who opposed it. But I'm confident that the bill will pass and Governor Sununu will sign it. And that'll happen, before summer. And it'll be another step towards true educational freedom here in New Hampshire, and that'll be a good thing. That's really all I have for today. Hopefully the weather gets a little warmer and this ice out there melts. Like I said, if you're watching this on Tuesday night, please, if you have to go out, drive safely. We don't want anybody having any fender benders, and we do not want to see any of our viewers, harmed by the weather. That's all I have. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye.